Welcome to episode 15 of the Football Conversations on Eclectic Football Interest. On this episode, I was joined by Rob White to discuss the life and legacy of his father, the Spurs and Scotland hero, John White. Rob, welcome aboard and many thanks for joining me. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Before your father's incredible talents led him to the bright lights of London, he was born and raised in Musselburgh on the outskirts of Edinburgh. What sort of upbringing did he have? What was life like for the young John White?
First and foremost, hi. Sorry, being rude.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, I think from so he was the middle one of three brothers, and he had a sister, Jeanette. But he had a brother Edwin, brother Tommy, and they were all fairly close in age. And actually, when my dad was born, my dad was so small that Edwin, who was his brother at the time, his elder brother, was actually sent away to live with relatives in Hawick because they feared that my dad might be too weak to survive.
Oh.
So Edwin was sent away for quite a while to live in Hawick, and my dad was brought up. And then Edwin came back, and I think it was quite a tough upbringing from the point of view of having two brothers that were very close age and very competitive, very physical, and actually, all of my dad's siblings are dead, unfortunately, now, but his two brothers, Ed and Tom, were of a bigger stature than he was.
Mm-hmm.
And to sort of fast forward a few years, when he was 10 or 11, his dad died. So my grandfather, his dad died, which meant that it was left to my granny White to bring the family up, and they lived in it was a 2-3 room, basically a 3-room ground floor tenement, and so quite poor, humble beginnings, basically.
Yeah, and I also understand that you mentioned his brothers there. He wasn't the only talented sportsman in the household.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, there's a lineage further back, but for now, yeah, I laughed because Uncle Edwin, who was the oldest, Uncle Edwin maintained that he was the best out of the lot. But unfortunately, he didn't have the track record to prove that. But him. I think Edwin finished up at Bradford Park North. And Tommy had a longer career. The younger brother Tommy, I think he still holds the record for consecutive goals in games for Hearts. He was at Hearts for a very short period. But I know when it was Rudy Scatchell, not recently, but in the recent past, we'll say.
The last time they challenged for the league.
He scored, I think he scored eight in a row, and Tommy's was 9 in a row. So Tommy still holds that record. And Tommy ended up playing for Blackpool via Crystal Palace, St Mirren, you name it, basically.
Yeah.
He definitely did the rounds of professional football.
So the name John White is synonymous with Tottenham Hotspur, but he also had a fantastic career at the start, north of the border in Scotland. What sort of impact did he make, firstly with Alloa Athletic under the legendary Jerry Kerr, and then latterly with Falkirk? And are you aware if there was ever any opportunity for him to remain in Scotland with any of the bigger sides, or was he always destined for England?
Well, I think there were numerous clubs that watched him. There definitely were numerous clubs that watched him, including Rangers, which is, we maybe go and talk about that later on, but their play, which is based around the book, that goes to White Hart Lane. There's a play which is coming back to North London the middle of January. But that is based around the fact, or part of the premise for the play is the amount of time that Rangers and other clubs watched him north of the border, but particularly Rangers, who would always report back, good player, he's just too slight, he's too wee, he needs to bulk up. but yeah, I think he definitely went for trials in Middlesbrough. For Middlesbrough, was watched by Walsall, was watched by Charlton, and north of the border, I think Rangers as I said, Rangers were the big club that were interested in him. Before that, he played at Bonnyrigg Rose, who have now managed to sort of climb a few rungs and into everyone's awareness. And then, yeah, as you said, he went to Alloa, which and growing up, well, I'll piece this together because the book that goes to White Hart Lane, which came out in 2011, I think, from memory. And part of the reason for doing that was growing up with a sort of a blurred picture. I realise now, a blurred picture of what my dad, who he was, what he was, and what he'd achieved, because I was only 5 months old when my dad passed away, and yeah, maybe I'll talk about that in depth as well later. But took a long time to fully piece together his career. So there were sort of a lot of gaps, even when I started doing the biography, that actually have become a lot clearer since. And for my sort of childhood, the piece that I put together, the puzzle that I put together, Falkirk with a bigger story, but actually I now know correctly that Alloa were the biggest story in his formative years. And consequently, I've actually built a more of an affinity with Alloa as a football club. And subsequently, you know, whenever I'm up, if I get the chance, I will go and see Alloa play. They have the John White Lounges there, where they host their guests on a match day. So I have an affinity with Alloa, and actually now having visited, I spent a lot of my youth in Musselburgh, summer holidays, but actually having made the journey from Musselburgh to Alloa now is easy by car. But actually, when my dad was doing it, it would have been pretty much of a commitment to do that, to go over.
Quite the trek.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of puts into perspective. And you know, I can't remember off the top of my head, but what the amount these guys were earning in those days was minimal, basically. But I think for him, well, I've talked to quite a few of the people at Alloa that saw him, and you know, it was the making of him, or the beginning of the formation for him. And then obviously he'd been there 2 and a bit years, and then Falkirk come in with a big offer. At the same time, he was doing his national service when he went to Falkirk. And again, part of the puzzle, which was when he was doing his national service, he effectively asked his PT instructor to help him to get as fit as he could possibly be. And again, I think that was probably the lessons that are detailed in the biography and talked about in the play, was this constant rejection and not being able to understand the constant rejection, because again, lucky enough to talk to people that knew my dad when he was a young boy at school, and he was obsessed with a ball. There's absolutely, or a round object. It doesn't have to be. It could be an orange. It could have been he was basically obsessed with it. I remember talking to one of his schoolmates, saying that in Musselburgh, where they lived on Link Street, and Link Street goes down to there's a big green area that effectively, and then you've got the beach and the sea, and there's a football pitch down there. And my dad's friend was telling me that, and it wasn't just a tale that would grown from nowhere, that my dad would quite often get a newspaper, and he would, I guess on a non-windy day, so that'll tell you how often, but he would place the newspaper, the evening news, on the centre spot, and he would cross the ball with his right foot, and then he'd go and cross the ball with his left foot, and he'd keep doing this, and effectively every time he got his right foot and his left foot hit the target, he would fold it in half and then do the same again until he'd basically got this thing. I think it's 7 folds, isn't it? A piece of paper. and it was left foot, right foot, both sides, and it was an absolute obsession with a ball. And the thing,
Mhm.
I guess, the penny for him dropped, that the reason he wasn't getting picked up, the frustration for him was that people just didn't think that he was strong enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
But from the team photos from those days at Bonnyrigg, Alloa, Falkirk, they look like grown men that are sort of surrounding this guy that wouldn't have been much older than 17 at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite amazing that dedication that people have who make it, and what they go through to make it. It's unbelievable. He made his debut for Scotland whilst he was still at Falkirk, which Falkirk fans might shout at the screen here, but that's quite an achievement. There must have been quite the performances there for that international recognition to come along. What sort of international career did he go on to have? What kind of impact did he make in Scotland colours?
Well, I'm proud to say, despite the accent, I class myself as a Scot, and
Oh, that's good. We're happy with that then.
and I mean, if I always say if Rod Stewart can get away with it, so can I. And I'm absolutely proud of the fact that my dad was never on the losing side against England, and
Oh, wow.
actually, he missed the game in Wembley, which we won't really talk about, but
Mm.
he missed that game. But yeah, he was part of the three in a row, three wins in a row against England. I think he had a really big impact on that Scotland side, and as I mentioned a few times previously, um, I think Dennis Law is firmly of the opinion that if my dad had not died when he died, that England would not have won the World Cup in '66, because Scotland, and that's, I mean, again, a real frustration is that they never qualified for a World Cup.
Oh, it's crazy when you look at the teams back then. It's bizarre.
Exactly, but again, if you go back to, I remember reading about Tommy Docherty, who was, I guess, the quite almost contemporary of my dad. Coming back from a tour with Scotland out of pocket because of what he'd had to spend, and yeah, so it is bizarre, but I guess it is quite inexplicable, and I think so. Yeah, I think he, well, again, probably stuff we'll touch on again, but I think for Scotland, as much as for Tottenham, it was a big loss, and who knows what history could have been, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. 1959, he made the move to Spurs under the legendary Bill Nicholson.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know of how your father adapted to life in the biggest and busiest city in Britain, having spent all of his life to this point in kind of bucolic regions of Scotland? What would have helped him to adapt and settle to life in London? Because I can imagine it was quite the shock.
Yeah. I mean, if even now, if you get the train to King's Cross, it's a busy place.
Mm.
I think it would have been, I think there would have been layers of complexity that put the journey from Musselburgh to Alloa into perspective.
Yeah.
And I guess slightly helped by the fact he'd been on his national service. So he was when he was at Tottenham for the first year, he was still doing his national service, but at least he'd had a year of he was representing the army in various tournaments. So he would have been travelling with that. But yeah, I think I do some. Well, I don't so much now, but I used to when I was writing the book. Just try and imagine what that would have been like. That coming into, effectively, Spurs were on the verge of becoming the biggest side definitely the biggest side in Britain, and arguably one of the biggest club sides in continental Europe. And to actually make that step up, I do know from press reports and from people that saw him play around that time, I think he struggled with confidence coming straight into that team. I think Bill Nicholson struggled trying to work out where to fit this player into the team. So yeah, I think that was difficult. I think not just one, I think at least two allies that he would have had were Bill Brown and Dave Mackay. who obviously through the international connection with Scotland would have given him some sort of grounding, definitely into life at Spurs. And I would think, well, I know for a fact there was quite a lot of tapping up that went on in those days. So I wouldn't have thought the transfer was the massive surprise that it's sometimes painted to be in the press.
Yeah. When did things like I read that in the book, and like you said about maybe a bit of struggle with confidence, but could go ahead and play in front of 60,000 and all this kind of thing. When did things really begin to click for your father at Spurs? When did he really begin to make an impact in the team, and was how important were guys like Dave Mackay? Because I can imagine that Dave Mackay was, maybe I'm getting this wrong, maybe he was quite a bit older.
I don't think he was. I'm trying to think what the age difference was actually. Maybe in football terms, he was 3 or 4 years older, which is quite a big leap of experience and a different character, I guess. But I think for my dad, it was the second. He joined in October '59, and I think really he settled in the start of the second season. Tommy Harmer, who Tommy was the generation before my dad. And again, a sort of confusion for me was part of the confusion of growing up was never. Obviously, my dad is associated for me with the number 8 shirt, but I've seen pictures of him wearing a 7 shirt because Tommy Harmer played in my dad's position. And for the first season, it still happens these days. I'm thinking of Tottenham at the moment, but you can have a player, who you're not quite sure which one's the better player. And Tommy had been in the side since '53, I think it was probably. So Tommy was well established. Tommy Harmer was well established in that side. But I think it was probably a level of belief that that Bill Nicholson and also Harry Evans, who was, it turns out, becomes my grandfather. Not at that stage in the plot, but I think Harry was a real people person. Bill obviously wasn't, but there was still, I think my dad probably grew into that confidence level that he needed. And I know
he was the assistant. Evans was the assistant.
Harry Evans was Bill's assistant, and Harry had joined just actually not that long before my dad. But he was very much the people person in the operation, and helped to, as I said, I don't think. Well, I know for a fact Bill's people skills weren't top of his list. It was getting teams to perform and getting the best out of individuals, and the what's the word, pastoral care was very much within Harry's remit. Because he was, well, I never met him because unfortunately he died before I was born, but from everything I hear, Harry was definitely a people person. I mean, he was a football person, but he was the more people side of that world.
The kind of the arm around the shoulder, and maybe Nicholson's the boot up the backside.
Precisely.
What sort of player was John White? Is there any kind of modern comparison? What kind of position are we talking about?
Well, that's been an eternal frustration of mine almost, and it's almost I guess it's a conundrum or a puzzle or a holy grail that will never quite be solved by me. And I think that's part of the. I wouldn't be on this podcast if I wasn't, but I'm a football fanatic. It obsesses my world, and it doesn't just obsess it because my dad was who he was. It obsesses my world because fundamentally I can't tell why, but so I'm always part of my growing up and writing the book and was trying to work out what sort of player he was. And whilst doing it, one of the I guess for me at the time, Spurs had Luka Modric. When I was growing up, there was a point where I was obsessed with Kenny Dalglish, even though I lived in Tottenham. I realised what divides that can cause in in Scotland at the time, but I think I had my hair probably looked a bit like Kenny Dalglish, and Dalglish, Cruyff, all these the players I loved watching growing up, Glenn Hoddle. In there is the outlier in that, which is Archie Gemmill, but that's another story. But the sort of, so at the time when I was researching the book, we had Luka Modric, and Modric was in. Obviously, this is pre Real Madrid, pre Ballon d'Or. Actually, and another sort of little reference point for me, which was Ardiles as well. He was somebody that when he arrived at the club, and I've chatted. I've been lucky enough to meet Ozzy a few times, and I've chatted to him about whether there's similarities. But anyway, I digress slightly. While I was researching the book, I had the privilege of meeting Jimmy Greaves quite a few times, and Jimmy is eternally thankful for the number of assists that my dad gave him, and I think it's well documented. But actually, so I asked him, and I said to Jim, I said, look, I'm trying to piece this puzzle together, and one of the links that I have is Luka Modric. And at the time, he just laughed at me and shook his head, and he said, "Oh, it's nowhere near your dad." Which, yeah, exactly. But I think possibly, well, the improvement in Luka Modric over the years probably might have taken him to somewhere near the player that Jimmy Greaves saw. But and I do think that, and again, I'm going to say this because he's my dad, but I do think that, bear with me on this one, football, we have certain players that fill a generation, and they become, it's the Pele, the best, the Beckenbauer, the Cruyff, the Messi, and they become the player where somebody goes, oh, he's a Maradona, or he's a whatever. And I like to think maybe it's, a leap of imagination, but actually, had my dad fulfilled his playing career and his potential, he could have been a genre where people, is that I think it is the right word.
Yeah, they kind of identify.
Where people say, "Oh, actually, yeah." Again, I sort of that brilliant Barcelona team of, I don't know how many years ago. I'm not great with stats and figures, but the Xavi and Iniesta. I think it was those sort of players, the players that can just read a game beautifully and play a weight of pass and anticipate, and it's part of the reason for the Ghost nickname, is that whole ability to inhabit a space that nobody really sees, I think.
Well, that actually was going to be my next question, because when I read the book, actually that shocked me that his nickname was the Ghost, while alive, because my own ignorance, I had always assumed it was something to do with what we'll go on to later on, but so that was just basically what I was going to ask you, was how did he earn such a nickname?
There's like a lot of things with my dad, there's rumor and conjecture over both. I think there are journalists from north of the border who claim that they were already using that before. They were using the term the Pale Ghost for him before his transfer to White Hart Lane, but it definitely caught hold when he came south. And I think part of it was that we use it a lot more. I guess we use it a lot more now. That ability to ghost into space.
Yes.
Ability to, there's I can't remember the total quote from the book, but there's a quote by Nobby Stiles coming off the pitch and just like utter frustration and just expletive after expletive. It just had no idea where the hell this guy was going to be. He would just, you think you'd had him somewhere, and then he'd pop up somewhere else.
It's always the mark of quality, isn't it? The movement, because it's almost natural to these guys. I could stand there and try and think about where to move all day and never be able to do it, but these guys they have like a map in their brain. Season 60-61 is Tottenham's finest hour. They won the league and cup double. Over the years, what have you learned from teammates and from all your research about your father's role in this amazing side and in the successful kind of campaigns that followed? I know that they were successful in Europe, and there was another FA Cup along the way.
Yeah, I mean, well, it'll probably come across here already, but I'm immensely proud of what he achieved. And I sometimes have to. I guess I don't know if it's I don't know what it, I don't know if it's a false. I don't know what it is, a modesty or something. But doing the research for the book, what I'd read prior to that, what I've talked, people. So Cliff Jones was, well, he still is one of the finest Welsh footballers of all time. Was at one time was dubbed the finest winger in world football, where when wingers were a thing of beauty and a thing of abundance as well as beauty, I guess, in those days. And Cliff was my dad's best mate, and not just Cliff, but other people would say there were three major pivots to that Tottenham team, the glory side, and that was Danny Blanchflower, Dave Mackay, and John White.
Yeah.
And you knew that if those three were playing anywhere near the top of their game, which they did, that was again something that's quite almost mind-boggling, is the consistency with which those three would perform. You would be in with more than a better chance of winning a game. And if you think about it logically, Danny, by his own admission and by the admission of other people, actually was a tactical genius. But also could read the game beautifully and could command the game on a pitch. Dave is one of my heroes. Dave Mackay. If you wanted to win anything, if you had Dave in the side, again, you'd have a pretty damn good chance of winning something, as is shown by his history. And my dad, I think, just gave that almost that weird sort of mercurial, spiritual something, almost hard to pin down. Well, ghost, but almost hard to pin down that quality of just the otherness. I think where the other stuff is all well and good, but actually you blend out those three things together, you have this unstoppable force that was quite remarkable, I think.
Yeah, so he clearly was a huge influence on the team, and I read quite an amazing statistic. I'm sure it said that he only missed 15 games for Tottenham, and in those 15 games, Tottenham only won one game. That's across the whole career.
I'm glad you've got that statistic, because I always go to quote it and forget it.
Yeah,
it's a phenomenal statistic. I mean, we have to. I guess statisticians would say you need to say, well, actually, they didn't lose that many games in those days, but they did. They only won one game out of 15 where he wasn't playing, which is it's quite phenomenal.
it is. It's amazing. In 2011, as we've mentioned already, your fantastic book, The Ghost of White Hart Lane, co-written by Julie Welsh, was published. In all the research and interviews that you've conducted for this project, like you mentioned, Rob, you were very young. What sort of picture have you been able to build up about the sad and tragic events of the 21st of July 1964?
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, I'm not picking you up or anything, but Julie is by far the writer within the partnership. She's again a genius, but she was the first first proper female football journalist, and cut her teeth on the Observer in the 70s, and a big Spurs fan and a lover of that double team. But the day of the accident, it became a bit of almost like a crime scene reconstruction for us. We sort of it almost became this timeline chronology of what happened and who spoke to him. And, beyond doubt, like many things in my dad's life, there's sort of a tragic comedy involved in the day, and lots of sliding doors moments. And So when we were writing the book at the time, I'm a photographer. That's what I've always done. I had a studio in the centre of London, and Julie lives in South London. We would meet up. She would come to my studio, and we would sort of sit around. It was like a very small group therapy session, I guess. But and there were points when we were working on that part of the book. I distinctly remember saying, how many red flags did this guy not want to see on that day, which is really easy to say with hindsight. And yeah, I guess a source of sadness for me, and I guess regret of what could have been or what might have been. But actually, we might move on to talk about the play, I guess. But the
yes, yeah, absolutely.
The play is very much based around that day, and begins with a team photo, which that's what they were doing at White Hart Lane on the 21st of July 1964. And then one thing leads to another, and it doesn't need a spoiler alert. It finishes at Cruise Hill. And actually, when the book came out, I remember talking to Matt Dickinson, who at the time was I think he was the chief sports writer at the Sunday Times, or the Times, basically came to talk to me about the book. And he said it was just, it's an incredible story anyway, but actually if you put that ending in it, if you did that as a work of fiction, people would say, actually, great book, but I'm not sure about the ending. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And that sort of, in a way, as I said a second ago, both of us sitting there, Julie and I sitting there thinking, how did that get to that point? But it's an easy one with hindsight.
It is, like you say, we all have, perfect vision when we're looking back. This summer, the Liverpool forward Diogo Jota, he also lost his life well before his time and in the prime of his career. The money can't compensate for grief, and I don't want to imply that in any way. But there does remain the fact that with modern footballers now earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a week, the immediate family, for all that they will absolutely suffer, they won't worry about where the next meal is coming from. What was life like for your own mother in the early 60s in the aftermath of your father's death? How were the club with her and the family in general?
They so you have to, two things. One, this is I guess an act of forgiveness towards the club, but we have to remember this is 1964.
Yeah.
Before institutions became so aware of mental health and all the positive things that they rightly should do. We also have to add another layer into the story, which was that Harry Evans, who was my mum's dad, Bill's assistant manager, Harry had died in the winter of '63, I think.
Right.
So my mum lost her dad and her husband within an 18-month period. Compounded with that, my grandmother on my mum's side, her and Harry had a child. There was 18 years between my mum and her brother, and so my mum and my nan moved into a house together.
Right.
And that was me growing up, and I remember, so the Bill Nicholson, growing up as a kid, Bill Nicholson, it used to, I guess as a kid, I used to probably think he had a double-barreled name because he was always bloody Bill Nicholson, was what he was referred to in our house, because there was definitely a feeling that not enough was done for us. And as I say, it was different times and people didn't know as much. The actual wider Spurs community from what I read and from letters I've read and from things, events that were put on, were fantastic and very supportive, and a decent amount of money was raised but actually to Spurs at the time, there was a testimonial match, and there was a public, the public helped to raise some funds, and Spurs announced in the press that they were kicking off this fund with £1,000, which was a lot of money back then.
Yeah.
What they didn't tell anybody was that, although what and it does make you think times don't change that much, was that at the end of each season and the beginning and end of each season, the Spurs players would got £1,000 bonus basically, and because my dad had died when he died in July, he didn't get his £1,000 bonus, and that was the money that was starting off this fund.
Yeah. He's paid for his own thing then. He's paid for his own.
Precisely, yeah. But I also, again, I'm 61, so I'm full of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And actually, something that struck me writing the book was that obviously it's well documented what an absolute football obsessive Bill Nicholson was. How I've talked to his daughters. How that affected their home life. This obsession with, he was either at the football club or he was at the allotment. That was Bill. And actually, I think partly, the Bill's plans were absolutely ripped from him by what happened to my dad, and I think that probably affected him massively in a selfish way. And actually, so I can't, the fund that was raised, it was nothing compared to these days. And actually, one of the biggest, again, nobody did it on purpose, but it was put into a really safe bond thing. So actually, I think the just over £3,500 that was invested for me in 1964, when I came to get the money when I was 21, it was probably about, I think it was about £6,000.
Yeah.
Actually, you think in 1964 you could have bought a really good house in London for £3,500. So, but again, it's nobody does these things maliciously. It's just the way the world works.
It was different times, and people were different. Men were different. The expression of emotion and things was completely different.
Exactly. It
for
was.
you,
sorry, I just on that was something that was really, which illustrates that perfectly. Was that so when we were researching the book, we went to Swansea to catch up with Terry Medwin. And Terry Terry was recovering from an injury in the morning of my dad's accident, and so my dad had played tennis in the gymnasium with Terry, which had obviously changed the course of the day.
Yeah.
This is what I was alluding to earlier, where there's this sort of sliding doors moments. But also for Terry, there was this, and for my dad's teammates, there was no perception that they would never see John again. And actually, so when Julie and I got off the train at Swansea and Terry was stood there, he actually burst into tears.
Oh man.
And for him, it was this, it was sort of squaring off the circle is the wrong term, but it was this sort of, he within me, he saw, he obviously saw my dad. And it was quite something to witness, actually. It was,
I can imagine it would be, and it's always one of those things where guys who were there on the day, they will always, it's not their fault, but there'll always be a guilt of, if I hadn't played tennis, if I hadn't done this, could this have happened? And it's an endless cycle. For you personally, Rob, at what point did you kind of maybe find out or realise that your father had been this fantastic footballer? And for better and for worse, how did this affect you growing up?
It's weird because I always had a sense of it, but never, because of where growing up with my mum and my nan, and there were no pictures of my dad around. There were when I went to Musselburgh, when I went to stay with my Granny Wyatt in the summer. There were pictures. There was a small cabinet in the corner with a few pictures and a few bits and pieces that my dad had picked up probably when he was on international duty with Scotland. But growing up in the house, in London, there was nothing about my dad that I could grasp hold of, and I document it within the book and in the play as well. This sort of notion that I knew about him. The analogy that I've used for years was if you were if you had if you were making a sculpture and you had a wire frame that you knew was a man, that was the picture I had in my brain of my dad. But this was this person we never talked about, that I was never shown in books but at some point, and this is where my fact and fiction blend. I knew I must have either had a sixth sense or something, that there was this box of there was a suitcase in the loft that I found, and that suitcase it was a bit like Tutankhamun's tomb to me, because within that suitcase, there was a suitcase and a box, and within that there were newspapers which detailed almost in chronological order, my dad's successes. There were scrapbooks. There were, there was coverage of when he died. There were his medals. There was international caps. There was two pairs of boots. There was a pair of shorts. There was this stuff. It was almost like this incredible box of stuff that was there. But I never asked anyone to go if I could go up there. For me, it was this place of really weird. Well, it wasn't weird. It was just natural to me at the time. This place where I would go, and I would find out more about my dad. But I would also get really upset in that space. Reading certain things would really trigger some sort of grieving within me. So it was quite peculiar, and I didn't. Again, I think your question was how that affected me. What again was quite weird, and it just came to mind then, was that obviously where you grow up, my dad, it was national news when the accident happened, and lots of people, it's not egotistical, lots of people knew who I was. But actually it was very rare if I went to like a friend's house after school, there was never any conversation about my dad. There was never. It was almost like this thing that people never quite knew how to approach me to talk about it. It's a really hard thing to describe, but really frustrating. And when I was a teenager, it sort of went the other way, where I guess it transmitted into anger, and it transmitted into silence for me, and all of those were quite negative emotions, but quite understandable now. And I guess that continued there was a point in my life where probably the last thing I would do would tell somebody who my dad was. And I do have friends, still got friends today, who at the time were really pissed off. How come I've known you for 3 years and you've only just now telling me that your dad was John White? For me, it was important, I guess now, in hindsight, doing the work I've done on it. It was a time where there were two strands to that. One, I was trying to build my own identity, which is strange now because I talk a lot about my dad, but also I was angry that there were lots of people that knew him that were touched by what had happened to him. And I felt that was my grief, that they didn't have a right to. Now partly through doing the book, I think I realise how important that was to lots of people. There are I've lost count of the number of people who tell me that when their dad or their uncle or somebody heard the news about John White, that was the first time they'd ever seen their dad cry or their uncle cry. I just top of my head now, somebody telling me that he remembers distinctly his dad hearing it on the 6 o'clock news and then just disappearing into the garden shed, and they didn't see their dad again that night. They saw him next day because he just couldn't, like you said earlier, we're still not great at it, men, but we are slightly better now at displaying our emotions. But at the time, when I was in my teens and 20s, I guess, for me, it made me really angry. I think that people took ownership of my dad.
When did you first begin to think about writing the book? And I suppose what sort of journey did writing it take you on? Was it as you expected it to be? And how did you find working with Julie on the project?
Um, Good questions. I'd always, I think, partly for my own sanity, not sanity. The analogy I've used previously, and I use it again, is, and I think this isn't just me. This is lots of people. Having done the book and talked to people about it afterwards, my history in my head, it was a bit like my mum used to have a sewing box, and if you open the sewing box, there was threads all over the bloody place.
Mm.
And to me, that's what my even in my 30s or 40s, I think there was a perception of, there were all these stories. Some were myths, some were newspapers, some were hearsay, whatever. That I just wanted to try and make some sense of. For at the time, well, at the time, I've got two daughters now that are grown up, older. But I think it was, well, they were the excuse. They were the people the book was dedicated to. But actually, talking about it now, it was for me. I
Mm.
wanted to try and make sense of this, and I was introduced by I was working on I was doing some photography for one of the Opus books, these massive tomes that they produced in the early 2000s, I guess. And I was doing some photography for that, and the guy that I was working with, the art director, 2 weeks later, he happened to be working with Julie, and he said, I was working with John White's son the other day, and Julie said, oh, well, I've always wondered what happened from a female's perspective. She wondered what happened to my mum and myself and my sister Amanda. And that's how we got introduced by Doug Cheeseman. And I think I think both of us, Julie and myself, when we've talked about this subsequently, and I think both of us probably just thought, we'll meet up and we'll talk. We'll flesh out a biography, and that's what will happen. And as
Yeah.
I alluded to earlier, the sessions were, at the start, they were a bit like a therapy session, and I think it really became quickly evident, probably more to Julie because that was her world and that's what she understood. That within this
Yeah.
book, the interesting, sorry, inverted commas, interesting part was the story, my story, of how it was for me growing up and how it had affected my life. My dad's story is a fantastic story on its own. Rags to riches, this indescribably good footballer. But actually, when you add in the human element of growing up without knowing, then that's when I think the book really started to make sense. And I give all thanks to Julie for when we took. I've forgotten. I think we started working on the book in about 2005. No, I think basically it took about 4 years of research,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we always joked that we would still be working on it now if we could be, because there was always some other reason to go and see Dave Mackay or Terry
Yes.
Medwin or Terry Dyson, or we'll just go and see Cliff and ask Cliff about something. So yeah, it was eventually it took the shape that it took, but I by the end of the process, I felt that I could write. The start of the process, I felt it didn't feel natural to me. I still don't, I still find pictures a lot easier than words, and I have full respect for. It's such a, it's a difficult profession. Put it that way, writing.
Well, you actually touched on it, Rob. You mentioned human story, and it is a human story. We've spoken a lot tonight about John White, the footballer. What did you learn about John White, the man, the character? What did you learn on that side of things?
Um, I actually that does link back to some of the anger that I faced earlier in my life, because the truism is that we very rarely speak ill of the dead, and we very rarely speak ill of the dead when they're extremely good, generationally good footballers. So all I'd heard was positivity,
Mm.
which is great to a certain extent, but actually when you're growing up making your own mistakes,
Yeah.
it's really quite hard to take some of that. So some of the human aspects of him were real interesting things that I found. The guy might have got drunk a few times, and he might have done stuff that he probably shouldn't have done, and
Yeah.
all of the again, back to the human side of this person who was fallible. We've woven it into the play, and we sort of do. We've got really good grounds to believe that he was. There was some sort of seasonal SAD, seasonal affective disorder.
Mm-hmm.
There was some sort of depression that had hit him, my dad, at some point, and I think that was linked to confidence and linked to various things. But so it was the frailties within him that, for me, as the son, were actually quite refreshing to think. Actually, yeah, you know what, you were human, but would have made my life maybe slightly easier if I'd have known that earlier in my life. But again, people are maybe just trying to protect.
Absolutely. Just before we move on, finally to the play, before we go there, I just wanted to say that there's a moving quote by the great Jimmy Greaves, which reads, and you'd sort of touched on this at the very start. He said, "Had John White lived, he would have been one of the greatest footballers of all time." As a Spurs fan, how does it make you feel to hear something like that? And what is the greatest tribute to your father as a footballer you've ever come across?
Well, as a Scotland fan, yeah, it's the same. It's a similar feeling of I was going to say frustration, but it's I guess there's pride in there as well that we will never know. But yeah, frustration, loss, and I guess it ties back with that generational the place that he could have had within the and I think that's part of the result of the book, but maybe it's part of the reason for the book, was trying to push him back into the limelight, because we can easily forget
Absolutely.
players, and I think even more so in the Sky Sports era. We only have to look at Cole Palmer to think, much as he's a good player, yeah, I don't know. So, yeah.
There's also a whole generation of people who are grown up who I find this quite shocking, that they're not interested in the history of football, and but for me, these are the things that stories like this, tragedies, these kind of things, Manchester United, Munich, these are all what the club are. They're all part of the club, the story, the modern thing, and I think it's important to keep them fresh in the mind.
I think, yeah, and I think exactly that. I think, actually, sorry, just going back to your question, and it just leapt into my mind there when I went up to Dave Mackay's funeral at Edinburgh. I walked into they had a reception beforehand at Tynecastle, and I walked into the director's lounge there, and sat at a table was Sir Alex Ferguson and Dennis Law, and I shrunk straight back to teenage me and went for the nearest corner and avoided eye contact. And then one of the directors of Hearts at the time came over, and he was just chatting to me, and I said, I thought I'll change the subject. I said, my uncle used to play at Hearts, Tommy White. And I was looking to see if there are any pictures of him, and he said, I don't think there is. I'll go and ask somebody else. A couple of minutes later, the guy comes back and he says, I've just been talking to Alex Ferguson, and we've worked out that you're John White's son, and he wants to meet you.
Oh, wow.
So I went over, and he could not have been nicer. His brother, well, you probably do know his brother's a massive Rangers fan. And his brother was there later the same day, but it was just phenomenal. The sort of the warmth and the time and the respect that he showed towards me, that Sir Alex Ferguson showed towards me, which is sort of testament to I guess what he thought of my dad as a player.
Yeah, I think that there's no higher tribute really than that, is there? Especially if you're Scottish, as Alex Ferguson, regardless of what your club team is. Have you any kind of, well, actually, you mentioned earlier on the play. I was going to say, any future projects planned in relation to the life and career of your father. Can you tell us a bit about the play, when it's coming back, what people can expect, where they can see it?
Yeah, the play was commissioned in. So it was basically it got to probably this time 2023, and I suddenly had a thought that actually I probably had the thought before, but the following July would be the 60th anniversary of my dad's death, and I was trying to think of a good way of commemorating
Mm-hmm.
this event, and I talked years ago with my sister. My sister, that was her that was her world, the theatre, that side of drama basically, and we talked years ago about it, and I've got a friend who's a writer and a director, Spurs fan, and I had this thought and thought, actually, do you know what? I think it'd make a good play. So I
Yeah.
approached Martin Murphy, and we then had this. It was almost like, the writing the book was a similar thing. When everything slotted into place, for me, it was okay. Let's try and get this played on July the 21st, 2024, and where could we do it? And I think I said, well, let's see if Tottenham would let us put it on there.
Yeah.
So a very, very long story, but I'll shorten it. Is that we got this play. It's a 1 hour, one man play where this fantastic actor plays various characters, but it's an adaptation of the book, but it's more than that, really. It's so it was everything aligned at a certain point, because Spurs have events, concerts and stuff. They weren't 100% sure, so it was in the press auditorium. It wasn't in the 60,000 auditorium. That would have been ridiculous, but it was in the press auditorium. It was a fantastic. It was on for 2 performances, and then, because we were doing that, the logic was to take it to Edinburgh. So it went up to Edinburgh Festival, and then this summer it had about a week in Jackson's Lane, which is a theatre in Highgate, London, Haringey, which is the same borough as Tottenham, and it's now going back to Jackson's Lane I think it's the 19th of January 2026, and it's the 19th to about the 28th or something like that. So it's on for just over. I think it's about 10 days, and information is on via Jackson's Lane Theatre, and it's been brilliant. Sorry, I knew you were about to ask a question then, but
No, that's fine. There you go.
It was. So I know nothing about that world, and it scares the hell out of me. But that's fine. I don't have anything to do with it. I love watching what the play brings to people.
Yes.
For one, it's a different audience. I'm going to stereotype. I'm going to generalize. Football fans, we don't generally go to theatre. We have our own theatres. But actually, this going up to Edinburgh was brilliant. It was there for a month, and myself and my partner, we went up for about the middle 2 weeks, and it was just lovely to be in a space and to hear the story related. An actor playing me is a bit freaky as well, but that's another story. And this again, I've said, it sounds really weird, but there were times in the play where the actor, it felt to me, there were split seconds where he brought my dad to life. And it's a really hard thing to describe. But again, another beautiful thing about the play, especially being the one, well, actually not just in Edinburgh, the one in London was the same. But in Edinburgh, there were loads of people that had either seen my dad play, or their fathers had seen my dad play, or, again, it's back to that, what you've said a little while ago about people not being interested in football history. It's just, it baffles me, because
It's strange.
Yeah, and I was thinking this morning how very few football plays there have been, and how great drama there is out. I know we do get the drama within, Sky Sports don't tire of telling us, but actually there are some fantastic stories.
I think, just like you said, though, I think that football, even without Sky and all this in-your-face coverage, it's been full of. I mean, like you said earlier on about your own father's era, there's not a great deal of footage available, but football was dramatic then. It's a dramatic game. It doesn't. I think it relies on the money of Sky and all this kind of thing, but it doesn't need it. If it was all stripped back, we'd all still love it tomorrow.
Agree, absolutely, 100%.
Well, Rob, if the play is anything like the book, I think it's people are going to love it, because for me the book was one of the best and the most moving football books I've ever read. And like I said, it's not just a football book; it's a human story. And I will post all links below this to the book, to the stage show, and all this kind of thing. And I just wanted to say to you, a massive thank you for sharing your time and your memories with me. This has been an education, a privilege, and I've really enjoyed it. And just thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you. It's been a real joy as well, and thank you for the praise that you've given for the book. That really touched me. It's actually made me quite emotional, because that's part of the. I guess for me, it's part of the remit of. I used to joke with Julie that we'd have a no tears, money back policy with the book, and I think it, for me, the project of the play and the project of the book, somehow it's about moving people, but not necessarily in a negative way, but just getting some emotion across to people of the story.
It does. It makes you feel something, and to me, that's what football's about, and that's really what reading's all about.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks very much.
Absolute pleasure.